If you want to understand the fall of Rome, you must take your eyes off wars, emperors, and intrigues for a moment. Because the real story is neither barbarian invasions at the gates nor weak leaders on the throne. The real story is invisible. It is hidden in numbers, accounts, coin mints, and the state treasury. The very mechanism that grew Rome was also the one that slowly tore it apart from within: the economy. At first glance, this mechanism looked completely innocent. In Rome's early periods, economy and war were separate spheres. In the 4th century BC, while Rome was still a city-state expanding within Italy, its military system was a natural extension of its social structure. Citizens fought, then returned home. In this system, there were neither massive expenses nor complex financial instruments, because wars ended quickly and the economy was local. However, as Rome expanded, this balance began to break down. Every campaign beyond Italy started to strain Rome not only militarily, but also economically. A farmer being away from his land for years meant not only his loss, but damage to the entire system. Production was suffering, tax revenues were falling, but the costs of war were rising. Rome's solution was simple, but risky: change the system. The state began to pay its soldiers. Thus, the first step toward a professional army was taken. This became one of the most important turning points in history, because from that moment on, war had to finance itself. Maintaining an army now required continuous money. This inevitably pushed Rome toward a new model: a war economy. The clearest example of this model emerged during the Punic Wars. These long and exhausting wars against Carthage expanded Rome's borders, but also emptied its treasury. When state resources proved insufficient, Rome made one of the most critical decisions in its history: to borrow. At this point, the equities class entered the scene. These people were Rome's first major investors, but this investment was not a partnership in the modern sense. It was more of a power agreement. They gave money to the state, and in return, they received privileges: the right to collect taxes, trade monopolies, interest income. This system saved Rome in the short term, but in the long term, it made Rome dependent, because war was no longer just a strategy, but a necessity. Without new conquests, old debts could not be paid. At this point, Rome's expansion ceased to be a choice and became a necessity. Growth was the only way to survive. And this made the system even more aggressive. Every new war meant new income. Every new income attracted more investors. This meant larger armies and greater risks. This cycle also distorted Rome's political structure. Generals were no longer just military leaders. They were also economic actors. The more conquests a general made, the more wealth he generated, and the more powerful he became. This is why politics gradually became an extension of war. At the same time, the Publicani emerged. These were private companies working on behalf of the state. They collected taxes, carried out infrastructure projects, and supplied the army. But there was a critical detail here: these companies operated for profit, meaning the more taxes they collected, the more they earned. This made them increasingly uncontrollable. For citizens living in the provinces, this system was brutal. Taxes increased, pressure intensified, and local economies weakened. While Rome grew richer at the center, the peripheral regions became poorer. This sustained growth in the short term, but in the long term, it began to break the system. And then the most critical moment arrived. Expansion stopped. There were no more new conquests. No new spoils were coming in. But the system remained the same. Debts were still there. Armies were still being paid. State expenditures were not decreasing. At this point, Rome's problem was clear. There was no income, but there were expenses. And here, Rome resorted to one of the oldest and riskiest financial methods in history: debasing the currency. Rome's main currency, the denarius, initially contained a high level of silver purity. This coin was not only a medium of exchange, but also a symbol of trust. However, starting from the reign of Nero, this system began to change. The amount of silver in the coins was reduced. In other words, coins that looked the same were actually becoming less valuable. This method worked in the short term. The state could produce more money, but it was damaging the very foundation of the system, because money was losing its value. Once people realized this, the process accelerated. Prices increased. Purchasing power declined. Trade became difficult. By the 3rd century, the situation was out of control. During the reign of Gallienus, the denarius had become nearly worthless. This was not just an economic crisis. It was a crisis of trust, because money was no longer reliable. And if money is not reliable, the system cannot function. At this point, society split into two. On one side were the wealthy, those who owned land, those who held gold, those with real assets. They were able to protect themselves from this crisis. On the other side was the public, those living on wages, those who saved money. They carried the entire burden of the system. Inflation came out of their pockets. Taxes were loaded onto their backs. This disrupted Rome's social balance. The middle class eroded, poverty increased, trust in the state declined. Instead of solving the problem, the state tried to manage it. Diocletian tried to fix prices, but it did not work. Because the problem was not prices. The problem was the money itself. At this point, Rome's collapse became inevitable, because the system no longer worked mathematically. Revenues did not cover expenses. Money was losing value. Trust was disappearing. And no reform could change this reality. It would be easy to end the story here. But the most important part comes after this. Because this is not just the story of Rome. It is a model. Even today, states borrow. Central banks print money, inflation rises, and most people are not even aware of it. It was the same in Rome. No one woke up one day and said everything is over. This process moved slowly, step by step, and silently. Then, the system collapsed. This is why the story of Rome does not belong only to the past. It is a warning. Because history teaches us this. Empires do not fall because of wars, but because of calculation errors. And when that error cannot be corrected, the end becomes inevitable.